the American Civil War, and Uncivil War, 1861 to 1865. The Confederate Army on the attack. In August of 1862, a Confederate army invaded Kentucky from Tennessee. They seized Frankfort and seated a Confederate governor. That same month, General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia had defeated the Union Army again at the Second Battle of Bull Run, much like the first Battle of Bull Run we mentioned last lecture. General Lee and Jefferson Davis believed that one more successful campaign might actually bring the British and French to recognize the Confederacy as a real country. Foreign powers were reluctant to enter into any conflict, especially on the side of someone that was going to lose. Although Britain and France both saw advantages of splitting up the United States, which would happen during the Civil War, neither Britain nor France was willing to support the Confederacy without being convinced that the South could actually win this thing. General Lee and President Davis were desperately seeking that decisive victory, which would allow them and bring in France and Britain to support the Confederacy. Confederate General Lee wanted to attack the North, the Union, on its own territory. Lee decided to stop and confront the Union Army at Sharpsburg, Maryland. In front of the town ran a little creek called Antietam. Lee deployed his 30,000 Confederate soldiers on some 4 miles of rising ground behind Antietam Creek. 2 days earlier, a Union corporal had found a copy of General Lee's special orders wrapped around 3 cigars, but the Union General McClellan refused to act because he thought Lee's troops outnumbered his own. When the Union General McClellan started deploying his troops on September 16th, he had 60,000 active soldiers and 15,000 in reserve. So if he had actually used his full forces against the Confederacy on September 15th or 16th, he might actually have smashed the Confederate Army, General Lee's army. But he did not. The Battle of Antietam began early in the morning of September 17th, when Union troops under the command of General Joseph Hooker attacked the forces of Stonewall Jackson across a cornfield that lay between them. The fighting was ferocious. The battle surged back and forth across the cornfield 15 times, going back and forth. Within 5 hours, 12,000 soldiers lay dead or wounded, and the weary opponents stopped fighting for the day. This day sits in history as the bloodiest single day America has ever suffered. Over 22,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing, more than all such casualties during the entire American Revolution, all in this one battle. General Lee of the Confederacy lost a quarter of his army, 1/4. The survivors headed back to Virginia the next night. The horror of Antietam proved to be one of the war's critical events. General Lee and President Davis did not get their victory for the Confederacy. Neither Britain nor France was prepared to recognize the Confederacy at this point. 5 days after this battle, President Abraham Lincoln issued his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation. Americans tend to think of the Civil War as being fought to end slavery, which is not incorrect. But even 1 full year into the Civil War, the elimination of slavery was not a key objective of the North and Abraham Lincoln. Despite a vocal abolitionist movement in the North, many people, and many soldiers in particular, opposed slavery, but did not favor emancipation. They expected slavery to die on its own over time. In the border states, Union states still permitted slavery, so there are states in the Union that have slaves. The situation at this time is full of problems for Abraham Lincoln. By mid-1862, Lincoln had come to believe in the need to end slavery. The opposition Democratic Party, remember Lincoln's a Republican, threatened to turn itself into an anti-war party, anti-Civil War party. Lincoln's military commanders were vehemently against him emancipating the slaves. When Lincoln indicated he wanted to issue a proclamation of freedom to his cabinet in mid-1862, the cabinet convinced him he had to wait until the Union had achieved a significant military victory, a military success, which they did at that Battle of Antietam we talked about earlier. 5 days after that battle, Lincoln decided to issue the Emancipation Proclamation effective January 1st, 1863. Unless the Confederate States returned to the Union by that day, he proclaimed their slaves shall be then and thenceforward and forever free. Now, it's sometimes said that the Emancipation Proclamation, it actually freed no slaves. Because think about it, the proclamation would only apply to Confederate states as an act to seize enemy resources. By freeing slaves in the Confederacy, Lincoln actually was freeing no people he did not directly control. So he has the emancipation, but it's only regarding slaves in the Confederacy, which he doesn't have any control over. So he really doesn't, the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't free anybody. And it doesn't address the slaves within the Union, the border states that are part of the Union. And Lincoln does not, I repeat, does not offer freedom to border states and their slaves. Now, while the Emancipation Proclamation actually didn't free any slaves, it does do something. It changes the worldview of this war. And when I say worldview, what's Europe and the world thinking about the United States and its civil war between the North and the South? Prior to this, many in Europe saw the North as picking on the South. The war being the North trying to control Southerners in the way they live their lives. So the North was the bully and the South was the victim. But what the Emancipation Proclamation does is it changes what the war is about. It's not about power now. The war is about slavery, a moral clause, a moral cause. Even if a foreign government wanted to intervene on behalf of the South, its population might object because it's about slavery. The proclamation, like I said, and I've stressed this a couple of times, and I want you to remember this, the proclamation itself freed very few slaves, but it was the death nail for slavery in the United States because now it changed the narrative. Now this war is not about power, it's not about states' rights, it's about the morality of slavery. It's about the morality of slavery. Eventually, the Emancipation Proclamation will lead to the proposal and ratification of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which would formally abolish slavery throughout the nation and the land. General Robert E. Lee of the Confederacy has a vision. He proposed to take the offensive once again and invade Pennsylvania and defeat the Union Army in its own territory. Such a victory would relieve Virginia of the burden of war, strengthen the hand of peace Democrats in the North, and undermine Lincoln's chances for re-election, because Lincoln does have to run again for presidency. It would reopen the possibility of European support that was closed at the battles of Antietam, where the Confederacy lost. And perhaps it would even lead to peace. The result of General Lee's vision is the largest battle ever fought on the North American continent. This was Gettysburg, where more than 170,000 fought and over 40,000 were casualties. General Lee's attempt for a decisive victory in Pennsylvania had failed. He had lost 28,000 troops, 1/3 of the Confederate Army. A month later, he offered his resignation to the Confederate President Jefferson Davis, whom refused his resignation. The hope for Southern recognition by any foreign government in the world was dashed. The war would continue for 2 more years, but Gettysburg marked the end of General Lee's major offensives. The Confederacy tottered towards its defeat. This was the beginning of the end for the Confederacy at Gettysburg. Only General Lee's Army of Northern Virginia remained as a substantial military force to oppose the Northern's Union Army. The Southern troops began to melt away as the end becomes nearer and clearer to most Confederate soldiers. General Lee sent a message to Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, saying that the capital, Richmond, could no longer be defended and that the President of the Confederacy should evacuate the city of Richmond. That night, President Jefferson Davis of the Confederacy and his cabinet set fire to everything of military value in Richmond, then boarded a train to Danville, 140 miles to the south. Mobs took over the streets and set more fires. The next day, Northern soldiers, Union soldiers, arrived, and one day after that, President Abraham Lincoln visited the city and sat in the office of the President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis. Confederate General Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, reduced in size to 35,000 troops, escaped to the west. They were starving and foraging for food. In fact, delays in looking for food allowed them to be surrounded. Now, 125,000 Union soldiers were surrounding Lee's army, whose numbers had been reduced to 25,000 troops and were steadily falling. General Lee sent a note to Ulysses S. Grant, commander of the Union Army, and later that afternoon they met in the home of Wilmer McLean. General Grant offered generous terms of surrender to General Lee. The Confederate surrender. In the terms of the surrender, Confederate officers and soldiers could go home, taking with them their horses, their sidearm, and personal possessions. General Grant guaranteed their immunity from prosecution for treason. At the conclusion of the ceremony, the two men saluted each other and parted. General Grant then sent 3 days' worth of food rations to the 25,000 starving Confederate soldiers. The official surrender actually occurred 3 days later, on April 9, 1865, when General Lee's troops stacked their rifles and battle flags. The official surrender happened at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. President Abraham Lincoln. President Lincoln's will to save the Union had prevailed. He looked with satisfaction on the survival of his country and with deep regret on the great damage that had been done by the Civil War. These emotions did not last long, however. 5 days after the surrender of the Confederacy at Appomattox Courthouse, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated.